Without further ado, I'm Jocelyne Cesari. I'm a senior fellow at the Berkeley Center, and it's really my privilege and honor to be part of this today, the celebration of José Casanova, who is not only a superb scholar and colleague, but also an excellent friend. I will follow the order of the panel, and just as a overarching comment, we have just listened to a superb synthesis of José Casanova's work and his foundational reflection on looking at religion in public space beyond privatization. And since the book has been published, it has been mentioned here and there, lots of things have happened. Not only the rise of transnational religious groups challenging the international secular order, but also religious policies by secular states from Turkey to China and now Russia, and the rise also of multiple modes of communication that has deeply and profoundly changed what used to be the public space. So based on these multi-level changes, I would like to invite my three colleagues here to provide their thoughts. My job will be to monitor your time, and I'm not going to give you more than 8 minutes, and I have a count watch here, so I will do some signs when you arrive at the critical end. So I will first introduce the three panelists. Like this, you will also have them in the order of presentation. So our first panelist is Rajiv Bhargava. He's the director of the Parekh Institute of Indian Thought at the Center for the Study of Developing Societies in New Delhi, where he has worked since 2005. His writings include What is Political Theory and Why Do We Need It? And The Promise of India's Secular Democracy, just a two titles. I cannot go further in this presentation. Greg Calhoun is University Professor of Social Sciences at Arizona State University and Centennial Professor at the London School of Economics. His newest books are Degenerations of Democracy with Dilip Gaonkar and Charles Taylor, and The Green New Deal and the Future of Work, edited with Benjamin Fong. Mirjam Konkler is a research professor at the Netherlands Institute for Advanced Study in the Humanities and Social Science at the Royal Academy of Arts and Sciences of the Netherlands. Her books include Female Religious Authority in Shia Islam, Past and Present, and The Secular Age Beyond the West, among others. She is a principal investigator of the Iran Data Portal, co-editor of the Cambridge Journal of Law and Religion, and sits on the editorial boards of journals in Iranian study, Middle Eastern study, religion, law. So, Rajiv, the floor is yours for 8 minutes.
Thank you. So, let me begin by expressing my gratitude to be part of this occasion. I'm really, really honored. I met Jose, I think in 1999 in Edinburgh. And we kind of hit it off immediately. We were staying at the same hotel. We were taking part in a conference, and the Bhargava family and the Casanova family became fond of each other, and we remained friends and worked together in several programs, several projects, traveled continents together, been to many countries, and remained extremely, extremely good friends. So this is also personally very important for me to be part of this. Jocelyne had asked us to talk about our disagreements in the note that she sent me. And there aren't very many, but I will begin by saying, all of us accept the distinctions between secularity, secularization, and secularism. My work has been on political secularism. And Jose has argued that political secularism need not be anti-religious, and it needn't be a necessary part of a stadial consciousness for which a religion becomes ultimately redundant. In other words, it can have even a positive understanding of religion. And that's something that I've always believed in. And in my work on political secularism, I've always tried to fight the idea that secularism indeed is necessarily anti-religious. And I'm now talking about the early 90s, when the dominant image among both those who defended secularism and those who opposed secularism was that secularism, at the very least, is suspicious of religion, if not exactly hostile to religion. And I think that's something that we share. There's also something that Jose says, that secularism political secularism tries to contain religion in its own differentiated sphere. And I have never seen, probably because I'm an Indian, familiar with Indian religions and the Indian context, I've never believed that secularism has tried to contain religion in a particular sphere. But I do think that religion has certain aspects which are not that, which require some state intervention, and therefore, if there is any instance where you can provide a religious rationale for exclusion or oppression, or if there's a direct link between some religious practice, some religious institution, and various forms of oppression and exclusion, then religion has to be contained. In other words, I do feel that we need to have an ambivalent attitude. Religion is an ambivalent phenomena, and we've got to have a more flexible policy. I'll come to that in a minute. I also believe that if secularism is not anti-religious, it can still be seen as against institutionalized religious domination in two different forms. One, when members of a religious community do all these nasty things to members of their own community, which is intra-religious, but also when members of one religious community do nasty things to people of other religious communities, as is happening, for example, in India now, when Muslims are being lynched and so on and so forth. But this is, so the state, if it is to be secular, if it is to embody the principles of political secularism, must fight these, the forms of institutionalized domination, which are, in a sense, backed or supported by religion. But this needn't be just a statist project. It can also be seen as a critical social perspective. In other words, there can be social movements which are pro-religious, but which nonetheless oppose these forms of religious domination. So apart from secularity, secularization as a social process, and political secularism as a political project, secularism can also be seen as a social project, which is quite independent of the state, where you can foster various values which are supported by religion, as well as keep guard against the same values being undermined by religion. So that's my first, maybe some disagreement. On the values, Jose thinks that his formulations for political secularism have been that it's related to statecraft, that it's a principled statecraft, or something like that. I agree with that. I would call it a value-based, I think it's a value-based perspective. And we agree that there are two very, very crucial values which are supported, which must be supported by political secularism. One is equality of citizenship. The second is freedom of religion. But in addition to that, I think we need to distinguish. I don't think he'd disagree with me. We need to distinguish, just 2 minutes. We need to distinguish freedom in the domain of what we might call religion, and freedom which is outside of religion. And there are, as I said, there are many ways in which religion can curtail the freedom of people in domains which are not, strictly speaking, religious. And political secularism needs to somehow intervene in that as well. So, and the other value, which is extremely important in the Indian context, which many people in the West do not kind of emphasize, is fraternity. What in India we call communal harmony. The state has the responsibility to foster certain kinds of relations between different communities. It's not just a question of supporting, individual freedom and equality of citizenship. Equality and freedom are not the only values. Fraternity is also very important, and fraternity here is a fraternity between religious communities, right? So Gandhi was a very important figure here. Last point, I had a third, but I'll skip that. Last point is on secularization and modernization, the link between them. And in my work, my early work, I had always focused on the category of the secular, but really not conceptualized, theorized, understood the category of religion. I'll just take half a minute. Yeah. And as I looked more closely at the idea of religion, I obviously realized that in much of the secular literature, including in India, religion is as it is seen through Christian and Western eyes. It's a very Western and Christian conception of religion. So our whole work now is to displace that and to parochialize it, to provincialize that idea of religion. We've always felt that secular in some ways is a Christian and a Western idea, but nobody has told us until very recently, to me, people like me who've worked on this, nobody's told us that religion is also a Western and Christian idea, and so that itself needs to be dislocated. Since the 19th century, that Western Christian idea has also become an Indian idea, but if we want to understand the history of what we call religious experiences, then the secular religious framework just doesn't apply, right? Insofar as it does apply, I would say that since the early 19th century, with modernization, what we are seeing in India is religionization, which is, in my understanding, not a very good, I wouldn't evaluate it very positively. So we're acquiring all the features of a religion, quote unquote religion, which are creating huge problems in India. The pluralism that someone referred to earlier is for us an ancient phenomenon. So we have had a long-standing pluralist imaginary which is deeply unsettled by religionization and by modernization. So unlike what is happening in the West, modernization, secularization, and then all sorts of debates about how religion is not really gone or it's been located differently, we in India find that religion is becoming more and more dominant, and with that, some of the problems that religion fostered in the 16th, 17th century Europe, those problems we've begun to face now. So maybe that's the difference. I don't know whether...
Yeah, thank you. Yeah. Thank you very much. Craig.
Thank you, Yossele. above all, thank you, Jose, for giving us nearly 30 years of intellectual reflection on these issues and this occasion today. Thank you, Hans, for terrific remarks this morning. I want to appreciate Jose's book from nearly 30 years ago, raise a couple of questions, and raise these questions looking forward to decades of further work from Jose, as well as others in the audience on them. So first, let me recall one of the important arguments of Jose's work was that secularization, not secularism, not the secular, secularization in the form of the sociological hypothesis, as it came to be called, was perhaps the only truly paradigmatic proposition in modern social science. This is actually a striking thing to say at the time of this, because it revealed the extent to which this had become a taken-for-granted assumption, but a highly productive taken-for-granted assumption, influencing enormous ranges of sociological work. And it's in relation to this, in part, that public religions had its transformative impact on the field, changing the way this happened. And it became part of a series of movements, but very distinctive. From the 1960s on, there had been a variety of calls to abandon the secularization thesis, but not so much to revise it internally. Jose's work was very distinctive because it didn't say, oh, let's just point out there's still religion. Let's just turn this around, this secularization hypothesis. Rather, let's rethink the very phenomenon that is being described here. And this is extremely important. Last but not least, on just secularization in that sense, this, as a paradigm, dominated over other understandings of the secular, or secularism, or indeed the relation between religion and secular, which became central for Jose. I'm going to be very telegraphic, noting the time on a few points, and then come back to the critiques. I appreciate Jose's dissent from some dominant but distorting stories, and Hans has already raised one. The idea that this is all about the Reformation, that this is all about 1648 and the particular agreements there, are not just wrong, but very misleading. They have distorted the field in important ways. The 1492 starting date is sound, but more than that, this whole look at the 16th century as a point of transformation is important. And it's also symbolic because it reaches beyond just the question of date. The date is to stand for the phenomenon in an important way. And I'll add that the 16th century focus links not just to the expulsion and the pursuit of homogenization in Spain, but very quickly to the New World and the challenges posed by the New World, including those that became the objects of the Valladolid disputations about the very nature of the human, of souls, of subjectivity, of how to work with received categories. So I think he's on the right track here. Second, Jose points out that there is real secularization. That is, that this is not simply something to be dismissed, because when you notice that the terms of the secularization hypothesis are faulty, you should not throw out, right, everything that was being discussed. He identifies a series of propositions. Differentiation, he thinks, is the still valid core of classical secularization analysis. Decline is the most questionable of the claims, with Western Europe appearing in many ways as an exception rather than a rule. And even within Western Europe, the story being complicated, Poland becomes a central case. And privatization, and with it, rationalization and pietism, liberalism, various relationships that lead into the political discussion, becomes a central focus. Jose gives a more detailed analysis that I can try to reproduce or even signal in this, in which the phenomena of privatization are important, but given a much more complex reading in this. They're not simply identified as automatically secular, because of course there is pietism and various kinds of privatization of religious engagements that are also important. Jose ends up emphasizing the idea of a dual sovereignty coming out of the real secularization, starting from the expropriations and so forth, and points out that this discussion of religion and the secular is confused with, but not identical to, the discussion of this world and other world. Secularization, Jose says, is the breakdown of that distinction. Right? It is the end of the ability to take for granted a distinction between this world and another world, and the production of a new, but also sort of quasi-spatial distinction of realms, religion and the secular, as both in important senses in this world. Public religions in this context, here I anticipate something that I wanted to know more about in reading this book, but also find in later work from Jose and still want to know more about. Public religions figure alongside nations and ideological movements as secular identities. And so part of the story, and Jose has explored some of this later, becomes how to think public religions, not just to find them, but then to think them in this broader way. In this context, deprivatization is the sort of central takeaway finding, the argument at the end of the Public Religions book. And Jose sees different potential dimensions: a utilitarian engagement in a secular world, anti-modernism or reactive organicism, and a return of the sacred or of the transcendent, which is where he focuses his attention, not on the others. And he points out powerfully the extent to which some of the 19th and 20th century movements of sacralization are very modern. The Lord's Pilgrimage, for example. But there are a range of ways in which what is taken to be always the old and putatively vanishing religion is the modern production of new religion. It's not something just inherited in that. His focus is on public religion in democratic public spheres in many ways, discussions of how this works, which I'll skip over in the interest of time, save for one, which is that he profoundly and importantly emphasizes a theme. I think I'm almost using his words, but not quite, to say the deprivatization of religion is an assertion of the right to the public sphere, right? That part of the power of deprivatizing religion, of producing public religion, is claiming the right to the public sphere. In other words, the illegitimacy of exclusion based on religion, including the exclusion of religion from the public. He's engaged with Habermas. At this point, this is a critical engagement with Habermas, but he anticipates the later Habermas in important and significant ways on this. Now the issues, even while Yasemin tries to discipline me on this. First, I worry that the frame in the book is very dominated by the political concerns. And so I wish for the wider understanding, not unlike Rajiv in all of this. And I worry about the assumption of national frames for the discussion of public religion and how we will think beyond this. Not that Jose doesn't mention the global, but that we face challenges there. I worry that colonialism is perhaps underestimated, as indeed my original comment on the two sides of 1492 suggests in all of this. And with colonialism, slavery, which Jose does address briefly, but which has profound engagements with ideas of the human and with religious arguments about what it is, whether it's just, and why it should be opposed. Right? I skip over more about globalization, but I worry about insufficient attention to the material conditions of secularization and secularity. Hans rightly referred to Jose in this regard as more of a Weberian than a typical modernization theorist, and I think this is true. Jose does attend to capitalism in specific ways, but there's a lot more to be said and discussed about this, rather than a political or religious, if these are to be compartmentalized, notion of the secular, the way in which a material capitalist secular is constructed, the economy, the market, and so forth, as powerful a compartmentalization as that of religion from the state. And lastly, science and technology. There is basically a treatment of science as a continuation of the Enlightenment critique discussion around truth. But of course, there's much more to the way science and technology have reshaped a world in which capacities are created, which are understood to be secular capacities to do things, to heal, to manage pandemics, to do many things in the world. And in this context, though, we may see these science and technology as overwhelmingly on the side of the secular, but perhaps this is the age of so-called spiritual machines, and certainly it is the age of desires for technological transcendence, even technological transcendence of human life and the soul. And we need to be able to think this potentially, maybe it should be called a post-secular science and technology. I'm not sure what the right terminology is, but it fits in the story. In all of this, as Hans said, Jose has stressed the necessity of embeddedness in moral traditions which need not be geographically local, but often are, but can be grounded in diasporas in a complex range of global forms. But even a global and globally significant thinker like Jose can still be locally embedded, as everyone who has been at a dinner with Jose, when someone says, Jose, sing for us. And Jose says, I want to sing you a jota of my village in Aragon. Thank you.
Thank you. So Miriam, the floor is yours.
Well, I would also like very much to thank the organizers for this honor of being included in this fantastic symposium, and thanking Jose really for the enormous inspiration over several decades. Now, Jose Casanova wrote in 2011 about the great sociologist David Martin. My own quote, my own appreciation would be that whoever works in the field of secularization and does not feel indebted to Martin's work is probably misguided. Whoever works in the field of secularization and does not feel indebted to Martin's work is probably misguided. What a terribly, well, complimentary thing to say, really. One couldn't give a warmer endorsement of someone's work. Now, I wonder, can one say the same about Jose Casanova? I remember a Princeton historian of Eurasia walking into my office a few years ago and conceding, for years I would read contributions in secularization theory and fail to see the forest among the trees. Everyone seemed to work with different concepts and look at different time horizons, and then claim to revise the previous scholar's grand ideas by looking at essentially a different subject matter. It was maddening, he exclaimed. That was until he came across Casanova's book, Public Religions, and its tripartite differentiation of the secularization thesis. Things fell into place, he continued. I began to understand that we must look at these processes distinctly, and all of a sudden I saw the light. End of quote. I must confess, I could relate to this historian's experiences all too well. I too felt public religions provided what few had achieved before, to offer guidance, order, and conceptual clarity among the dense forest of often contradictory secularization scholarship. Casanova provided an enormous service to the discipline by popularizing a distinction that David Martin had already undertaken 15 years earlier, but with less success. Public religions reorganized the debate. Scholars writing on secularization no longer got away with underspecifying which of the three processes their work really dealt with precisely. David Martin's intervention in the 60s and 70s had not yet achieved this. Part of public religion's success was due to its attempt at bridging the Atlantic divide in extant scholarship. It featured 5 case studies from 4 countries: Catholicism in Spain, Poland, Brazil, and the United States, and Protestantism in the United States. The 2 case studies of Christianity in the US took up more space than the remaining 3 case studies combined. The Catholic case studies focused on the development of Catholicism in the aftermath of Vatican II, and in retrospect, Casanova reflected on the fact that Vatican II had been a major stimulus of his own intellectual trajectory. In all 4 Catholic cases, the acceptance by Vatican II of the modern secular state of human rights and individual autonomy enabled Catholic organizations to exert a democratizing role in their societies. And they did so not only by influencing the private piety of individual believers, but also by taking public stances on questions such as nuclear deterrence, family planning, abortion, homosexuality, animal rights, etc. This internal reform, Casanova pointed out, had not led to the further privatization of religion and faith. Instead, the Catholic case studies demonstrated that Vatican II had unleashed Catholic forces to enter the public debate, for Catholicism to become a voice in the public sphere. While the sociologist Thomas Luckmann had described the privatization of religion as a major component of secularization, Casanova's case studies documented the opposite. The evacuation of religion from the state could in fact facilitate an important public role of religion. Some critics of the book pointed out that while Casanova's empirical evidence was overwhelming, his focus on institutions prevented him from speaking about the unorganized, such as the unchurched. As a result of this growing demographic, privatization was still a major sub-process, or could still be a major sub-process of secularization, these critics argued. People believed without belonging. But while critics were right to diagnose that Casanova's focus on institutions necessarily closed the gaze to many other forms of lived religiosity, some operated with a simple privatization-deprivatization dichotomy that really missed the complexity of the approach taken by Casanova. Casanova's public religion is not the binary opposite of private religion and private religion, and private and public should not be regarded as mutually exclusive categories. Both processes can proceed simultaneously. Religions can go public, for example, when religious leaders publish commentary on current affairs, even while for the individual certain aspects of religious practice move increasingly into the private sphere. But more importantly, as some of Casanova's work later sought to further demonstrate, a singular notion of the public would miss the point. Rather, one had to think of the public as a tripartite distinction of state, political society, and civil society. Secularization in Casanova's first sense, that is, the emancipation of the state, law, bureaucracy, etc., from the influence of religious authority, had evacuated religion out of the state, but this did not necessitate a confinement to the private realm. Believers formed religious political parties, religious organizations formed civil society organizations, for example, in the realm of charity, and participated in civil society initiatives. In other words, religion flourished in political and civil society, even while being excluded from state affairs. Casanova's book, Public Religion, also made a significant contribution to the study of religions in democratization, a contribution which democratization scholars, typically working in the discipline of political science, have only partially paid tribute to. His case studies demonstrated the ambiguous role public religions played in the mid-20th century and following. In Franco's Spain, public Catholicism sought to restore pre-modern religious hegemony and homogeneity, illegitimated the Francoist regime, and helped silence its critics. Yet, from the 1960s onward, the church allowed opposition figures to use the spaces of the church as safe sanctuaries. And incidentally, I would add, similar dynamics unfolded in the 1980s in the GDR, when church spaces became the primary gathering grounds for oppositional activities, as did the mosques of Iran in the anti-Shah movements of the 1970s, several of which also started out as democratic civil society movements. Oh, okay, I will now skip some very brilliant paragraphs about, and is it just 1 minute really?
1.30 seconds.
Okay.
1 minute and 30 seconds.
Well, Casanova's 1994 book is heavily indebted to Jürgen Habermas's notion of the public sphere, and at times he subscribes to Habermas's view that public participation itself has a democratizing effect, that by entering the public sphere, by taking part in public debate, and by opening one's normative convictions to rational challenge, one is undergoing a self-democratizing process. One is necessarily becoming a more intrinsically democratic actor. In hindsight, whether Catholicism as public religion promoted and protected civil society in authoritarian contexts for intrinsic rather than instrumental reasons is, of course, open to question. And one could look, of course, at a number of examples from Poland and Brazil, I think also parts of US Catholicism, that reveal not a concern for the bonum commune, the common good, but rather for bonum particularia. In other words, the church protects its interests or engages in public debate if it affects its intrinsic concerns about, for example, influencing policymaking in the realm of family law, biomedical issues, primary and secondary education, but not intrinsic democratic concerns. So, in other words, perhaps public religions discounted the possibility of an instrumental approach to participatory politics a little bit too much in its enthusiasm for Habermas's trust in the self-democratizing effect of public participation. But to close, Casanova's book has done much to de-ideologize the secularization debate. Like David Martin, he regards secularization neither as a unitary process, nor as unidirectional, nor as necessarily anti-religious. Instead, secularization consists of a large number of discrete and separate elements, many of which are not necessarily analytically related and best studied separately. These discrete elements need to be assessed empirically, and if they relate in a particular way in one society, their relation may be entirely differently conditioned in another. This was the research design Casanova pursued in his 1994 book, and in my reading, no work has since persuasively challenged that approach. Perhaps most importantly, no scholar working on secularization today can afford not to situate his or her work within the tripartite distinction of the secularization debate that Casanova pointed to, and most studies will also in one way or another relate to the question of public versus private religions, even if many have still not digested the tripartite distinction of the public into state, civil society, and political society. In that sense, I think it is true to say of Casanova what he wrote about David Martin a decade ago. Whoever works in the field of secularization and does not feel indebted to Casanova's work is probably misguided.
So before I open the floor for Q&A, I would like to invite you maybe to respond to each other, or maybe if I may take a few minutes, because you have very overlapping presentation. So I will refer to José's work. And as you just said, Miriam, José's work is to look at two levels that usually are not put together, which is what's called the institutional level, the state, religious organization, interaction, and the social level. But it seems to me that you are not on the same vision when it comes to the two. Rajiv, you posited yourself in what's called political secularism. I'm going to play evil advocate here. And so is it that you put more the emphasis on the state, religious organizations, interactions, more than on the social? I would not say social, honestly. I would rather say societal level, because even at the time of the paradigm of secularization, religious organizations could still do social action. Right? I mean, they were not completely out of the society. What they could not provide is a vision for the political community. That was completely out of the question. And I think we are now at a period where that is what is challenged. Religions do not content themselves with, education or after-school activities. They want to have something to say on the future of the political community. And again, that's not something that has ever disappeared. I work on Islam, it has always been there, even in the modern parameters. So how do you deal with this interaction between what you call political secularism, and you mentioned this as a secular, as also a social project, being also a social project. So if you want to say, I would like to give my points.
Sure.
So Craig, I like very much that you brought the three polarization that again trigger very different form of scholarship. The immanent, transcendent, the sacred, profane, the religious, political. And actually this dimension has inspired my own work recently. So it seems to me that religious communities before the secular process are eminently based, and this I'm referring to Durkheim, it's sacred and profane. There is no religious and politics. So I understand your resistance on dating or providing a date on such a process. But the moment that the separation emerged, and here I talk under the control of Charles Taylor, this is an historical moment. There is a mythology around it. And we in social sciences, especially my colleagues in political science, we have eaten up very much the mythology. But there is a moment, a critical juncture, where the secular versus religious emerged. And I would say again, using Charles Taylor, that this is a momentum of the contribution of Latin Christendom to the secularization process, okay? So how do you combine this historically dated process with your vision that I completely support, actually, which is to try to denationalize also our lenses of approach. But what the work shows from historians and anthropologists is even the one today who challenge the national communities have been socialized within these national communities. Again, I'm going to give a very trivial example, but if today people talk of an Islamic state, even at the transnational level, it does come from the fact that they have been educated in a vision that to have politics, to be influenced in politics is to capture the state, which is a modern vision that the sacred-profane divide didn't cover. So that's my question to you. And actually, Miriam, we have this discussion a lot. It's also my question to you, because we are political scientists, and so I always push back on looking only at the state. While I think you said something very important, it's about fraternity. But the state is not responsible for fraternity. Fraternity should be an element of what builds the political community. The moment you don't have it, you have a very split, fragmentized, not only political community, but social scene. So how do you reintroduce this dynamic? Again, it may be between these two levels of the institutional and the societal here. So maybe you don't have to respond. It's just I want to give you maybe more incentive to say a few things, because I've been very sharp on the time, and maybe to warm up the audience to say also to get it. So, please go. Yes, Miriam.
Well, I had a question to Rajiv, and we agree on most things. I had sort of, I think, a comment on your commentary regarding the imposition of religion as a notion, and I wonder whether your comment should be read as something that you would differentiate, where you would sort of locate the differentiation between the North Atlantic world on the one hand and other geographies on the other, or whether it's rather a differentiation between Abrahamic religions and other forms of religion. I can think of many Islamic contexts where it would seem really odd to argue that somehow religion has been an imposition. It is really part of 1400 years of local history, and of course notions change over time. But nevertheless, there's a strong sense of which differs from Muslim society to Muslim society. But of course, there's a strong sense that yes, we have one religion, and these are the insiders, and those are the outsiders, and that might be quite different from non-Abrahamic phenomena. So I wonder whether you would comment on that. The other was regarding the Jose's own reconsideration of public religions 25 years later, and the criticism, of course, of the national frame. And my own work is often transnational. Obviously, it's very important to look at transnational phenomena, also at the external phenomena of nation states, who, of course, meddle in the religious markets of other societies. And so that is an enormous field of research that I think could still be populated much more than is the case now. Nevertheless, I think internal religious reform, which is really, to me, the core, or one of the core ideas of public religions, how does it occur, when does it occur, is often, in my experience, so nationally defined even Vatican II had to be nationally translated in Catholic societies through local intellectuals, not only Catholic intellectuals, writers, all sorts of people who were concerned with issues of religious pluralism, religious liberty. And one can't assume that a sort of internal religious criticism and reform in one society will spill over into other societies that are characterized by similar religious traditions. It simply doesn't occur that way. Indonesia, Robert Heffernan here, and Malaysia are such good examples. They are such strong internal reformist ideas in Indonesian Islam that are not really received in depth in Malaysia and haven't for 20, 30 years, even though there are so many connections between these societies. And I think one can find many other examples between German and Polish Catholicism, or French and Spanish Catholicism, etc. So I do think that these national frames are important in certain respects, and with regard to religious reform, it seems to me that whether we like it or not, this is very often how they proceed.
Yeah, Craig. Yeah.
Let me just pick up on that point, and then another. I completely agree. What I would suggest is the issue is not to get rid of the national. There's a lot of discussion in the same mode that there was previously discussion about getting rid of the secularization hypothesis, as though there was nothing there. So, oh, we have to be cosmopolitan, we have to be multinational, let's get rid of the national. The issue is rather not to take the national for granted, to recognize the histories and the complexities in a critical thought about the national and when things are or aren't nationally organized and what follows from that. So, an implication, you're exactly right about Vatican II, and this is part of the background to Jose's nationally constructed case studies in the Public Religions book. But then what does it mean that they're nationally constructed? And what happens in other ways? So what happens to nationally constructed case studies of religion in the context of, say, the EU and the project of the EU, and how this then affects and produces various sorts of responses or whatever. So I think, there's that. But this is also leads to stressing something else in this related to Rajiv's points. Rajiv alludes more than once in his comments to India, in this case, but to essentially the phenomenon of multiple secularisms. And so one of the things that became an important discussion in these last 25, 30 years is the existence of multiple secularisms. So it's the idea first that the secularism is not simply the absence of religion, a presence, it has its own ideology. Secondly, it's not just one presence or ideology, but secularism takes different forms shaped by different religious, civilizational, and indeed political contexts. And this is one of the places where the colonial comes in. So the Indian example, it is a problem for the colonial government to produce a category of religion in a way that is distinctive. So it's not just, scholars come and say, there's this category religion. It is that the state and the legal apparatus produce it. This isn't, I think, entirely new to the colonial era or the modern era, but it is distinctively true of modernity that there is a production of religion from a secular viewpoint. That is a production of the category of religion to include various tokens of the type religion from secular standpoints, which may not be anti-religious, but simply confront, as in the legal apparatus, the need to address them. In the US version, who gets a tax exemption on the basis of being a religion? So we delegate to the Internal Revenue Service an authority to determine what is a religion in the United States. It is actually the primary governmental determination of what counts as a religion. And it's from a very secular viewpoint on religion, right? I think this isn't foreign to all of the past, and I think part of the point about Abrahamic religions that Miriam brings up is that in the Quran and in other settings, there are something sort of similar, that is, attempts to speak to a category of religions, and also attempts to exclude from the category of relevant religions, practices, folk practices, and so forth, and all of this. Jose, I think, rightly in this then dimension, sees state development as central to the production of the phenomena of the secular viewpoint from which religion is going to get defined in various versions in the modern era. What I was trying to assert is not, maybe not quite the same as others, or as Elsing construed it about political society. What I was trying to assert was about the secular outside of politics. That the political frame, that is the dominant concern of the public religions book, is how does religion and how does secularism figure in politics, in democratic public spheres, and so we get the tripartite state, political society, civil society. We also get another cognate tripartite distinction, with Jose indicating that there's representation and etatism and mobilization and all of this. But this is still within a primarily political object. What I wanted to suggest is that that underestimates the way secularism works in the world, and that and this has an effect back on politics. Mammon, right? Mammon and markets as domains of a construction of the secular. Lots goes on. Now, you can spiritualize that. You can have Wednesday morning prayer breakfasts and among bankers. You know, it's not that it's intrinsically anti-religion, but it is a huge domain in which the dominant understandings, discussions, and actions are constructed without direct reference to religion for many people in many places. Humanitarian action, again, may be hugely motivated by religion, but organized in ways that cross an account of it. Medicine, I mentioned as the example of this. So the fact that we've built such large institutional apparatuses for doing things that people really care about in the world and approach them in ways that are not necessarily directly religion, underpins part of what the secular is in modern societies. That can change, but my point is just it's not constituted only out of the state-religion dichotomy, which is the central project for Jose's analysis, which I think is historically hugely important, but also out of other divisions, like religion and science, religion and markets, and so forth.
Thank you.
Yeah, so I think we all agree that sociological processes have normative presuppositions and normative implications, but these are not always foregrounded. Hans points out that Jose is one of those people who actually does, somewhere in the book, he does foreground what the normative implications are.
Yeah.
But generally, this is not done. Normative, political secularism, on the other hand, is a very clearly more explicit normative or normative ideological project. It talks about things which are yet to be realized, or at least it talks about standards and principles by which to judge existing reality critically in order to push it in the direction in which its own, the construction of its own values are meant to be. Now, so that's my work has primarily been on this normative project, but lots of ways in which it overlaps with various sociological and now historical sociological theses and so on. I think that states have been very, very central to this normative project, and particularly post-colonial states. For them, these normative projects have been very important, either in the secular direction, or since we're talking about modernity, or in the direction of a particular religion. So I make a distinction between religion-centered states and secular states, and I made lots and lots of topologies of religion-centered states, theocracy and states with establishment just being the two of the many, and many varieties of secular states which distinguish themselves by not only by how they unpack the notion of separation, which in some sense has become key to the idea of of political secularism, but also in terms of the values for which you need to separate. And in different societies, these societies are either, these values are either lexically ordered differently or combined differently. Some are explicitly multi-value, some sort of emphasize a single value, and so on. So there are all kinds of ways in which secular states differ from one another, and in my work I've talked about that. But I also have recognized over the years that apart from states, and this is where Craig and I agree, and I'm sure others too, that we...
Just us.
Just us. Oh, well, exclusive truth with two people here. It's a social, it's a social project of against institutionalized religious domination. And it doesn't have to be from outside religion. It can also be within religion. Mm-hmm. In India, for example, in the 19th century, a lot of reform movements, and likewise in many other parts of the world, including Europe, lots of reform movements coming from within religion, freedom-oriented, equality-oriented movements. I mean, against caste, for women, and these are not necessarily, they haven't left the framework of religion altogether. Yeah. So Gandhi is a very good example again. I mean, but there are also purely, movements which don't have religion as part as a framework, but from outside religion, they criticize what is happening, where there are oppressions and exclusions and marginalizations and various forms of humiliation and degradation and so on. All of this being criticized, and I think these two come together, these different social movements, and I think secularism is also something, it's still a project, right? Still something to be realized, some criticism, but it's not, it has stayed somewhere in the background or on the sidelines, but it's not central.
Rajiv, you stay there at the separation thesis, and I'm surprised because I know you in other work to share with Jose, with our late friend Al Stepan and others, and understanding that separation is one form in which secularism might be targeted, that an idea of fairness among religions without separation
absolutely.
is equally.
I don't use the word separation for Indian. I use the word principal distance. I mean, so because I don't believe in strict separation.
We agree that separation is one way, but the differentiation is there.
But I was talking about, it's a dominant sort of metaphor.
Sure, there are various rhetorics. I just wanted to keep you true to your good
So that's one. There was something that you said about fraternity.
Fraternity,
But I hear, what is the background assumptions. I mean, religious diversity of religions has to be part of the natural or cultural landscape here as something which is not an optional extra, but something which is just there. And I think it is in such societies which have which has religious heterogeneity rather than religious homogeneity. I think the states have to play a different role. They have to foster a quality of relationship, a certain good quality of relationship between different communities. So states, or they can at least provide conditions. Even rule of law, which is sensitive to religious diversity, will have particular laws which encourage inter-religious harmony, inter-religious amity, and so on. So I don't want to leave, I don't want to make state the only agent, but I also don't want to leave states completely out of this. The state always provides some kind of, it facilitates, it makes it possible for good fraternal relation between different communities, right? On this question of religion as a category, I remember reading in The Meaning and End of Religion, Wilfred Cranford Smith's book, a very interesting point that he made, which has always kind of stayed with me, that the idea of religion really came within Christianity for in the 3rd and 4th century, in the sense, in a particular sense, of course. And then for 1,000 years, it sort of stayed dormant, and it was picked up later in the 15th, 16th century, the so-called wars of Europe, your wars of religion in Europe, which can also be wars of, incipient nation states in Europe, the formation of states. I mean, this is a time when religion becomes a very central category once again. And it's that notion of religion which really travels to large parts of the colonized world, right? There is a very closely related notion of a religion which is present in the Dharmashastras within what we now call Hinduism. There is also obviously a very, very interesting idea, very closely related idea of religion, which is present, which is brought by some Islams, which have come from some parts of the world. Every Islam doesn't bring that. Yeah. Every area doesn't bring it. Islam comes to India from so many different countries and from so many different cultures. And they all bring the different Islams. Some Islams are very closely resemble this religion. And by religion, for me, and that's why I don't, treat this category of religion as I don't evaluate it positively. I think it's done great harm. One, of course, is the 3 conditions for the formation of a religion. So how religious experiences and religious practices, which are not very different from philosophical experiences and philosophical practices. I mean, there is a philosophical way of life. A Buddha, is he a philosopher? Both are for India alien categories, ancient India. Religion comes from Latin, Christianity or philosophy comes from Greece. We don't have either of them. And it's very difficult to figure out who Buddha is. But if you want to call him philosopher or religion, we can say that that happened. But we have gurus. I believe that Christ was a guru, and with followers. And something happened in the 3rd century when it becomes a religion. I mean, that's my understanding. It's developing. I'm very, I'm not really that much of a scholar of all the religions, but something happens. What are these 3 conditions that must be fulfilled before all these philosophical religious practices and experiences suddenly begin to be subsumed under religion? 1, the theological condition, where there is a very sharp distinction between what is true and what is false within religion, right? So true gods, true false gods, that idea, which creates huge problems, and the Western secular world has fought against it, and I'm sure there must be a lot of movements within religion which have also tried to fight these dogmas. That's kind of exclusivism is one. The second, I think, is the creation of something comprehensive. See, we all have some kind of an ethics of self-fulfillment that may be dependent on God, one God, dependent on gods and goddesses, very common in India, and independent of God, which is, again, a very strong tradition in India up to the 9th century. Almost every philosophy or religion has no God. Buddhism, Jainism, the Mimamsa and the Sankhya tradition, which legitimizes all the Vedic ritual practices, which are Brahminical, they're all what we would now call atheistic. So we have strong atheistic tradition in India. Now, so these ethics of self-fulfillment are there everywhere, and the idea here is to dig deeper and to go higher. And this is something which is obviously very, very important for human beings. But then we also have social relations and regulation of social relations, norms of social interaction, which very often become, a part of controlling others, having power over others. There are, institutionalized structures of hierarchy and power You have gatekeepers who decide who's to enter, who is to exit, all sorts of features which we would find very uncomfortable. Now, they can be totally distinct from one another, as they were in India, which is how, for example, the caste system was never seen, in my view, to belong to what is called what later became Hinduism. Yeah. It was not. It was only in the late 18th, early 19th century that the caste system came together with, a variety of Hindu ways of finding self-fulfillment. But before that, everybody could be, people like Muslims were part of the caste system, Christians were part of the caste system. There were Buddhists who were Brahmins, but so they were part of the caste system, yet they didn't. Just 1 minute, to bring these together as one comprehensive system, so that there is no distinction anymore between ethics and these norms of social interactions. That, I think, is the second social condition of the formation of religions. And the third, of course, comes where, I don't know when Christianity may have come with Constantine. Islam got a package in the 6th century already made, and India is witnessing something of that happening right now. Absolutely. A very historical moment when there is a state which wants to back only one comprehensive religion called Hinduism, which has come into existence in the early 19th century. Yeah. Right? So this is what I call religion, which I think is which is what a lot of people wouldn't want their religions to be, this religion, and a lot of secularists fight against it, and I'm sympathetic to it. And that is what I meant by religionization, which is very specific to colonization, modernization.
And nationalization.
And these are first the way to become.
Yes, of course.
The nationalization is a condition.
Absolutely.
A religion, these Hindu, let's talk about just Hindu, Hindu religious beliefs and practices, they could not have come together as one system without nationalism. Absolutely. And the idea of who is a true Hindu and who's not, this idea could not have come without a certain kind of nationalism. So it's this nationalism which has created national religions, and these national religions then are backed by a state, which is what we are witnessing today.
Thank you. We open the floor. You have been very patient. Please.
I'm Roger Trigg from Oxford. You mentioned nationalism. We've heard a lot about globalization this afternoon. I wonder if the panel would agree with me that in recent years, and perhaps exacerbated by the pandemic, there's been a much greater sense of belonging to a locality, perhaps a nation state, perhaps national identity. It's showing itself rather even in some forms of nationalism at the moment. But I think people are reacting against the idea that they're part of a wider whole, and that the difficulties of global supply chains make that more obvious as well. But do you think there is a withdrawal from the global scene?
Sorry, Craig.
All right, I'm going to say it. Sure, I'll take responsibility for this. Yes, but it's complicated. So there's lots of assertions of national identity. There are projects of deglobalization attempting to roll back certain kinds of interdependence. Many of these are very fraught, it seems to me. But I wouldn't rush to think globalization is going away so much as a certain kind of ideological celebration of globalization is losing its attractiveness. And many of the interdependences, the infrastructures, the trades, the supply chains you mentioned are there. So seeing supply chains are risky, will many companies choose to try to have shorter ones rather than longer ones? Perhaps. Will there be new tariff barriers? Perhaps. Is there likely to be a complete reversal into nation states or something like that? I think not. And look, and that's complicated too, because there's regions, it turns out, matter a lot in this deglobalization. A pullback from everywhere all at once doesn't mean that there isn't a new integration across Asia, for example. And a last quick point on it, when you say local communities, this can mean very local communities, at the village or neighborhood level. It can mean not quite spatially defined, but pretty local communities, like most of what people mean by faith communities. But it can also mean larger denominational or other religious structures, which use the language of community about themselves at large scale, the community of Christians, the Ummah Islam, and so forth. And one of the features of this world in which public religions become such a crucial topic is a tension over scale, in which the world is organized at very large scale and the world is organized in direct interpersonal relations and in various intermediate ways. And so, you know, this is a feature. And the ways in which religions have developed and changed have been related to this, have been part of the construction of the large scale and all that. But we confront that. And so it seems to me there is no opting out of a world that is divided in this way, Habermas's system and life world, if you want to call it that. There are different ways of handling it. What I see, to the extent I'm looking at the same world as these sort of the same things, is a great deal of desire for belonging, vested in good and bad projects of belonging, but a great deal of desire for belonging, and a great deal of fear of what the global and various others in the world portend, of the threats that we face.
Yes, the gentleman in the back, and then I think.
I'm Brandon Vaidyanathan from Catholic University of America, sociologist. I've got a question for the panelists and maybe even Jose about whether you've looked at religious responses to political secularization, how religious communities interpret and make sense of political secularization, particularly when they are supportive of it or tolerant of it or opposed to it. And just one example that comes to mind from India is there are Christian groups that are now engaging in constitutional literacy programs to help their members recognize we belong to a secular country. So they're using the word secular precisely to legitimize their identity as citizens when they're being told that they don't belong. Right? And I'm curious to know if there's anything of that sort going on where there could be religious motivations to preserve political secularization.
Yeah, maybe.
Yes,
I can,
please.
absolutely. I mean, I mean, the two big pillars of Indian secularism today are the Muslims and the Christians. And that's because the constitutional secularism of India not only supports individual rights, but also group-specific rights, particularly religious and linguistic, but religious rights. And I think that is one of the reasons. I mean, it's not just because they want to assert themselves as citizens, which is also true, but also because secularism guarantees them certain, and constitutionally, as fundamental rights, certain, and they're not very many, but still very important group-specific rights to, for example, maintain and administer their own schools run by these religious communities, right? So I think those are, and we've always thought of political secularism is not for us, you know, secular humanism. I believe that there isn't really a necessary connection at all between them. Political secularism is required precisely in India and places like India, perhaps in the world, because of this diversity of ethical worldviews. So I think political secularism is very strongly supported. It is undermined by a majoritarian Hindutva, right? But it's supported by all people who take their citizenship more seriously than their religious identity, which many secularists do. But it's also supported by those who take both their citizenship rights and their religious identity seriously, because the constitutional secularism in India provides support to both. So there are religious motivations, particularly among the minorities, to support political secularism very strongly. If you take a survey, you will find maybe 16% or 14% of Muslims, which is really the whole population of Muslim population of India. All of them would be supporting secularism, right?
I would like to add something about the Muslim case. Since they have been the most at the forefront also of this political secularism, what has happened since actually the rise of Al-Qaeda and ISIS is a rejection of the capturing of the state to embody the religious community. So this is an interesting distinction that has not emerged, at least since the two world war, basically. So, but they are not with the secularists, because secularists have a project for themselves. They don't have a project for the community. So what they are saying, these new groups, is we want to invest the religious community as a civil community. It doesn't mean that we have to capture the state. So these are interesting discrepancies that are emerging here, and they appear in Muslim majority and in Muslim minority situation. I follow Europe. The most interesting debate are in Europe, because they are drawn even in the public space on this question of the state by the secular actors themselves. What Macron is doing is really politicizing religion in a way that some Muslim theologians today are saying we do not want to be part of this debate. So, yeah. Please.
Well, of course, a lot of research documents that minorities are often at the forefront of fighting for secularism. I think one mustn't jump to the conclusion that it's necessarily for intrinsically secular reasons, right? And so that's an empirical question. In some cases, that is indeed the case. In others, it's rather instrumental reasons because, well, the reasons are obvious. It's about equal citizenship.
There was another hand before. Yeah, go ahead.
Really excellent panel. 3 very different presentations, and of course a commentator who added 4th equally rich presentation. But Rajiv, thank you for your, I recall our discussions, I think 15 years ago, but your real clarification of religionization and the emergence of the modern category and community of Hindu and Inuit is such a superb. I wanted to just congratulate Miriam for, referencing the book, Jose Casanova's book, and putting it in the context of comparative sociology of secularization, not least of all by adding, and I think I'm looking to Jose for confirmation of this, by adding to the list of influences on Jose David Martin's work, the late David Martin's work. And I think I've seen this in some of your work. I think I sent an email to you a year ago or saying, hey, I didn't realize you were familiar with David, but you clearly are. And in fact, you more than anybody has recently sort of brought David back into the limelight and emphasized his contribution both to a general theory of secularization and the way in which he was way ahead.
Hans
he was not a modernization theorist.
It was Hans Joas, not me. But anyway.
But just now you did as well. You brought up David Martin. But last but not least, so I just wanted to thank you for that. But Craig, I wanted to thank you too for your political sociology, but I did have one reservation. And then again, we're focusing today on Jose Casanova and on Jose Casanova's book in, identifying, I think correctly, Jose's sociology of religion is informed by a theory of political society, democratization, and civil society. I think that's correct. But you also hinted that he didn't take the role of ideas and science significantly seriously. One of the sub-themes, and I'm asking you to comment because I may have misunderstood what you said, but just to refer back to his book, as Miriam did so well with her exposition, her approach to it. The thing that strikes me about the book, the sub-theme in the book, is his emphasis on the way in which it wasn't just state-society relations, political society, civil society, but there was a scientific revolution. This is a sub-theme, and I think we often overlook it in the book. He comes back to it again and again, and then he comes back to the way in which religious thinkers, Catholic and others, struggled with this other sphere. It wasn't politics, it wasn't state-society relations, it was the emergence of modern science. And that, I think, although we tend to, kind of read, I do too. I read Jose primarily from a political sociology of this sociology of religion. There's an interesting sub-story on the scientific revolution and the rise of a sphere, a differentiated sphere.
Sure, and this is another way in which Jose is a Weberian. There are differentiated spheres in modern society. My suggestion, appreciating Jose but wanting to push further on this, is not to think of science just as ideas. And so my suggestion was that Jose's got a great, largely Weberian account of the scientific revolution alongside the Enlightenment as a shaping force and part of the constitution of the domain here. What I wanted to suggest is that science becomes an institutional structure and informs the development of other institutional structures like medicine, the presence of which and the often secular organization of which complicates and adds to a story centered on state and religion. So I read Jose, who's here to speak for himself if we read him wrong, as suggesting that crucial to the emergence of public religion are specific kinds of state-religion relations, but not only state. And I want the not only to count for more, right? That there's a bunch of other things going on. And I've given the examples of the economy and things like that. So if this is a reformulation in which the couplet religion and secular become basic, right, to the modern structure as distinct from this worldly, otherworldly. And there's a potential compartmentalization, and the differentiations can take the form of where do you put things into the religious or the secular camps and all of this. There are other structural transformations going on besides the political structural transformation, of which democracy is at the heart. And that's what I wanted to put on the table. And it's not captured by pointing to the scientific revolution or ideas, because it's not just a matter of those ideas. It is a matter of the structuring of the institutional relations of the modern world.
Jose, you have been called to the floor several times. So.
If you remember the chapter on secularization begins discussing the four simultaneous processes in the 16th century, I mean, the Protestant Reformation,
exactly.
The scientific revolution, the birth of capitalism, and the birth of the modern state, and how these four processes are the ones that are related. Obviously, the book, yes, it deals mainly with the question of political ethics, as opposed to the economic ethics that was the core of the Weberian comparative sociology. My focus is more on political ethics than economic ethics. Not that I don't think the whole problem of capitalism and secularity is central. But yes, in this book particularly, this was the emphasis. As to for the scientific revolution, of course, I mean, it was mentioned, it was Benjamin Nelson. I mean, he did a lot of work in science, and of course, Merton. I mean, the Weberians, you have to take the Weberians, not only the economic ethic, but the Weberians like Merton that then goes and bring the category of inner-worldly asceticism to the institution of science and the Puritans. And then people like Michael Walzer, that bring to the question of the Puritans, the saints, right? So again, obviously, while Weber himself may have focused on economic ethics, other Weberians expanded the analysis, and I take those things for granted. So yes. Just one brief thing on the nation state. After Vatican II, it's true that it had to go local, but it was not only local. It happens that we went continental. You had the formation of conference of bishops. The Latin American cannot be understood. It's not each Latin American country. It's the fact you have Medellin and then you have another Latin American conference of bishops, out of which liberation theology comes, and then it becomes simply a dynamic that reproduces itself in Africa, in Asia, the ASEAN Conference of Bishops. I mean, being the fact that Catholicism is such a minority religion of Asia, and yet the ASEAN Conference of Catholic Conference of whatever it's called, Asian bishops, that brings together Japanese, Koreans, Chinese, South Asians, Malaysians, Indonesians. I mean, groups that otherwise don't get together in Asia nowhere. And it's the only probably group that thinks of Asia as a category of peoples and cultures and religions. And so you have, because all the other Asian religions cannot do that, because they are too geographical, right? The Buddhists are Buddhists in their Buddhist area, the Muslims are Muslims in Muslim area. Precisely because Christianity has no geographical location other than the Philippines, can play this role of being this solvent of an Asian consciousness that then addresses all the problems of Asian society simultaneously. So this is a characteristic thing that we cannot think anymore either nation or cosmopolitanism or local. I mean, it's not anymore a nation. Now we go local at all levels.
Yeah,
and
exactly.
so it's very important that we take all these processes and how they influence each other.
Yeah.
Any more comment? Yes, please.
If we call David Martin's and Jose Casanova's approach in the sociology of religion a political sociology of religion, this does not mean that they say the only explanatory factor in the sociology of religion is politics. So one cannot say, so let's add to politics, let's say, scientific developments and the fact that some people experience their faith to be shattered by scientific developments or something like that. The point, definitely in David Martin, and Jose should speak for himself, was to say, from a cognitive change, nothing follows directly for religion. People who think something follows from scientific development for their understanding of religion do that in a sphere of political struggles. They mobilize an argument from science for a political debate about the relationship between religion and science. So I think these are two different versions. Yeah? It remains a political sociology of religion, even if you include all sorts of scientific, cultural, and other changes. It does not get a sociology of religion that is partly political, partly science-oriented, partly culture-oriented. Do you understand the difference I'm trying to make? And I think it's clearer when we distinguish between politics and le politique, the political. What Martin and Casanova had in mind, I think, is this dimension of the political, not politics in the sense of state-oriented decision-making processes.
Of course, Hans Georg is a great interpreter of both. Hans Georg is a great interpreter and a great friend of both David Martin and Rodman. And he edited a great volume on David Martin's sociology.
Absolutely. Can I add a quick footnote to this? Thanks, Hans. Great comment. I think part of the issue is the category sociology of religion doesn't do justice to Jose Casanova or David Martin, or you, or a variety of other people. And that among those who are distorted when they are contained within the idea of a sociology of religion are people who are really trying to analyze civilizational structures and their changes, which involve in varying combinations religion and politics, the state, and so forth. So the object here is something larger that can have various foci. And so my suggestion in this, at least, isn't so much that this is that either religion or politics as separated domains is the object, and then we should be adding others. It's that an interdependence and reconfiguration of the differentiated value spheres in Weber's terms is an object for a civilizational analysis of the history of this. But I want to suggest we won't get that story adequately unless we situate the accounts of state and the political broadly and religion in its various manifestations, and secularism in relationship also to some of these other changes like capitalism. That was my point. I take José's work to be on this bigger, to be filling in part of a much bigger canvas rather than a contained miniature.
I think one would say that fundamentally, if we look at globalization, we have at least talk of global capitalism, the globalization of the Westphalian system, and then the globalization of religion. Those are three interrelated processes that one has to take very seriously.
Well, is there another hand somewhere? But before we close, Jose, if I may, I mean, it's not that globalization has challenged the religion-political divide. It has been on the move all the time. There is no definitive fixed categories. And I think that's what your work also was pointing at. And so it's not that the global or transnational challenge the religious politics. What is religious and politics since the beginning is a line of competition between two different communities. I mean, again, we have to move away from religion as being associated with individualization. What is eminently politic is some religious actors having a political project based on their religious community that is not acceptable in the current secular modern pattern, even in countries where there is no separation of religion and state, or where there is multiple adjustments. And that's the common thread today. What I see everywhere is a rise of people who are saying that my religious communities has a claim on this political community. And it has nothing to do with the level of personal religiosity, actually. And that's, I think, a term we have not used at all, but the whole taken for granted modernization based on individualization doesn't work, at least in the parts of the work I have studied. The politicization of Islam comes from a rejection of individualization and reinserting a political claim on Islam as a community. So, maybe it's opening too much of it. It was more a closure than reopening the debate. So, are we? That's okay. I have my backstage manager.
We're over time.
Thank you very much for your attention. Thank you.